I raised my phone, smiled like a Sunday school teacher, and said, "Your Honor, may I play a video of her from last night?" The color drained from Samantha's perfect face, faster than water down a drain. Judge Morrison's eyebrow climbed like a warning flag, and the bailiff stilled mid-step. Somewhere behind the paneled walls, a clock ticked, and I could swear even that sound decided to listen. I am Dorothy Mitchell, though everyone calls me Dot, and 8 months ago I learned that grief doesn't just knock, it brings a wrecking crew. I am 68, old enough to know the temperature of a lie before it leaves the tongue. Samantha, my daughter-in-law, learned to sell anything during 2 decades in pharmaceutical sales, including grief dressed in couture. She wore a sleek black dress to my boy's funeral and again to court, chin tilted just so, tears cued like lighting cues on a stage. Her lawyer called me manipulative, a schemer who preyed upon a dying man's fear. They said I coerced Michael into changing his will, that I slithered into his mind and pushed out his wife to steal what he'd built. I stared at them from the gallery and thought about all the Sundays Michael spent at my table, the way he still brought me flowers on Mother's Day, the way he laughed at his own bad jokes until I had to laugh too. My son called every Sunday, and he wore his seatbelt every day. Careful. Good. Mine. The phone rang at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I remember the red digits on my nightstand and the tight ache in my chest that I prayed was only heartburn. "Mrs. Mitchell," a young voice said, professional and practiced. "This is Officer Bradley with the State Police. I'm calling about your son, Michael." There is a part of the brain that refuses delivery of certain sentences. He said there had been an accident, that a semi-truck ran a red light at the intersection of Route 15 and Miller Road, that my son died instantly. I heard the words, recognized their shapes, and still some stubborn part of me set them down and walked away. Not my Michael. Not the boy who fixed anything with duct tape and determination, who changed my porch light without being asked, who promised he would call next Sunday and always kept that promise. Samantha reached the hospital before I did. She fell into my arms with mascara tears and the ring he'd worn warm in her palm. And for a moment I stopped disliking her. For a moment we were just 2 women cut by the same blade. But the funeral planning pulled back the curtain. She wanted the $10,000 casket, a symphony quartet, a display of grandeur my practical son would have mocked. "Michael deserves the best," she said. And I thought the best is not price tags. The best is kindness and loyalty and staying when life turns dark. 2 weeks after we buried him, we sat in a quiet office for the will reading. Samantha was poised, certain, already building a life in her head with his house, his savings, his insurance. The lawyer's voice was careful as he read. Michael left his house at 847 Maple Drive to me, hoping I would find comfort there. He split his life insurance and retirement accounts equally between Samantha and me. I watched her face crack, clean as porcelain, because the woman who could sell grief had never imagined being told no. "There must be a mistake," she said. "We discussed everything just last month, but there was no mistake, only a secret decision made 6 weeks before he died, a decision he kept from both of us. That should have been my warning. My careful boy knew something and chose strategy over confession." 3 months later, a courier handed me a stack of papers while I was watering the roses Michael planted last spring. The lawsuit accused me of undue influence, of fraud, of preying upon a vulnerable man. It painted me as a spider who spun a web of fear and pulled my son into it. I sat at my kitchen table with my lawyer, James Worthington, a patient man with wire-rimmed glasses who had known our family for decades. "They don't need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt," he said softly. "They only need more likely than not." The timing, he admitted, looked terrible. 6 weeks before his death, a dramatic change to the will. No argument on record, no fight, no reason. At least, not one we could see yet. What Samantha didn't know was that reason was walking toward me on a pair of teenage legs, carrying a phone and an apology. And what I didn't know yet was how a grainy night vision video and a string of late-night calls would begin to stitch my shattered world into something like truth. Tyler stood on my porch at 4:30 p.m., sneakers scuffing the welcome mat, a lanky boy trying to look older as he held out his phone like a confession. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think you need to see this," he said, voice wobbling. The video was night vision gray. the timestamp burning in the corner like a tiny moon. 11:47 p.m., the night before Michael's funeral. The drone had drifted across our back fences and settled over my yard, where the porch light drew a pale pool on Brick and Jasmine. In that pool, Samantha lifted her face to a man who wasn't my son and kissed him with the ease of a habit. For several seconds, I felt nothing at all, just the hollowed-out quiet that comes after a bell stops ringing. Then a slow thaw of anger rose, clean and steady, the kind that doesn't scream because it intends to endure. "Do you know him?" I asked, and Tyler swallowed, nodding. "That's Mr. Rodriguez from the insurance office on Main. Carlos Rodriguez. My mom uses him for our car policy." The name meant nothing until it meant everything. I thanked Tyler and told him to keep the original, to email himself a copy, to put it on a flash drive and tuck it where only he could find it. "Don't delete anything from the drone," I said. "Make backups, 2, maybe 3. He nodded with solemn gravity, a young soldier entrusted with a message. When he left, I sat at the kitchen table and watched the video again, pausing on the turn of Samantha's wrist around the man's neck, the thoughtless familiarity of it. Grief had made me tired, but betrayal made me precise. I typed Carlos Rodriguez Insurance into my laptop and found a profile boasting about maximizing life coverage and claims. Another click brought up public records, a modest ranch in Springfield, an underwater mortgage, a 10-year-old car, 2 children who deserved better than this tangled web. I pictured Samantha in her perfect black dress with that lofty tilt of her chin, and understood I hadn't just disliked her. I'd sensed the hum of something engineered. For the next 2 weeks, I became the woman I'd never had to be. Meticulous, relentless, methodical at 6 a.m. with coffee, and at 10 p.m. with tea. I built a timeline like a spine, vertebrae of bank statements, social media check-ins, and public filings. 3 months before the accident, she began sessions with a therapist who specialized in grief and life transitions. 2 months before, she joined a support group for women facing major change. 6 weeks before Michael died, the week he changed his will, Samantha updated her own will and adjusted beneficiary designations. Alone, each fact was a low hum. Together, they sounded like a generator running in the dark. The phone records were the hinge. Michael had insisted on a shared plan, old-fashioned and frugal, and I still had admin access. At 1:10 a.m., I finished scrolling through 8 months of logs and sat back as the pattern snapped into focus. Calls, texts, late-night messages between Samantha and Carlos, beginning shortly after Michael's diabetes diagnosis. 8 months. It felt like a hand gripping mine from the far side of a wide river, steadying me. In the morning at 9 a.m., I carried my evidence to James Worthington. He adjusted his wire rims, watched the video again, and said in that calm courthouse voice of his, "This changes the field, Dorothy. It maps motive. It explains Michael's choices." He warned me the other side would try to slice adultery away from probate, to argue that private sins didn't infect legal instruments. "Then we'll show context," I said. "We'll show why my son protected his house and split his policies. We'll show the timing isn't suspicious, it's surgical." We saved the video for last, our quiet thunder. James called it our nuclear option, but to me it felt like truth with a timestamp. All weekend we rehearsed. He asked me what changed in Michael's voice those final Sundays, and I told him how he'd sifted through old photo albums, how he'd asked about trust and love like a man testing floorboards before a long walk. By Monday at 8 a.m., I dressed in the navy suit I wore to his funeral and pinned his father's flag lapel to my jacket. The courthouse smelled like floor polish and old paper. Samantha sat across the aisle, a portrait of virtuous grief, while her lawyer rehearsed outrage with the confidence of a woman who has never been surprised in public. When the bailiff called the room to order, I caught Samantha's eye and, God help me, I winked. Because beneath the quiet blue of my jacket, I carried a boy's drone, a trail of calls at indecent hours, and a truth ready to be played on a screen big enough for everyone to see. The courtroom buzzed with polite murmurs, the kind that precede the beginning of a play everyone knows will end badly for someone. Judge Morrison entered, her black robe swaying like a curtain parting. She was in her 60s, composed, the kind of woman who could silence a storm by simply looking at it. Samantha's lawyer, Patricia Grimm, began with polished theatrics, voice smooth as glass. "Your Honor," she said, pacing before the bench, "this case is about manipulation, a mother preying on her dying son's vulnerability." Her words were knives wrapped in velvet, each one landing like a carefully rehearsed wound. She painted me as a lonely widow who couldn't let go of her son, who whispered fears into his ear until he rewrote his will under emotional duress. I sat still, hands folded on the table, feeling the air grow heavy with lies so elegantly told they almost sounded true. Samantha dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her diamond ring catching the light like a signal flare. When Patricia finished, James rose. No theatrics, no raised voice, just steady truth delivered like stonework. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Michael Mitchell was of sound mind, that his decisions were deliberate, and that the changes to his will were not only rational, but necessary." Samantha flinched, a tiny movement, like a nerve exposed. James laid the foundation. Michael's diabetes was well controlled. His doctor testified he was calm, optimistic, and fully competent. His estate lawyer confirmed Michael had come alone to revise his will, had requested confidentiality, had spoken with clarity about his intentions. Patricia objected twice. The judge overruled both times with an arched brow that said patience was a luxury she did not extend often. And then James opened the next door, the phone records. The courtroom projector hummed softly as rows of dates and times glowed across the screen. Months of late-night calls between Samantha and Carlos Rodriguez, beginning long before Michael's death. "These records demonstrate sustained communication inconsistent with professional contact," James said, his tone even. Samantha's hands trembled. "Your Honor," Patricia interrupted sharply, "this is irrelevant to the validity of the will." "Not if it establishes motive," James replied, and the judge nodded for him to continue. The silence that followed was thick enough to lean on. That's when Samantha broke. She leaned toward me, voice low and venomous. "I'm going to leave you with nothing, you useless old hag." I didn't even turn my head. I just lifted my phone and said clearly, "Your Honor, may I play a video of her from last night?" Confusion flickered across the judge's face. Samantha froze, color draining from her cheeks. "Mrs. Mitchell," the judge said, cautious now, "are you introducing new evidence?" "Indeed, Your Honor," I said. "This footage was taken the night before my son's funeral." James connected my phone to the courtroom display. The first seconds of grainy night vision filled the screen. The backyard, the faint glow of porch lights, Samantha in the arms of Carlos Rodriguez. The gasp that swept through the gallery was sharp, collective, human. Samantha lurched to her feet. "That's not what it looks like," she shouted. "Carlos was comforting me. I was grieving." The judge rapped her gavel. "Sit down, Mrs. Mitchell." The timestamp on the screen read 11:47 p.m., March 15th. "And when was the funeral?" Judge Morrison asked. "March 16th at 2 p.m., James answered. The judge's mouth tightened. "So less than 14 hours before her husband's burial." She turned to Samantha. "Is that correct?" Samantha's lips moved, but no words came. Her lawyer's hand on her arm couldn't steady her now. James didn't let the silence rest. "Your Honor, this footage corroborates the phone records. The relationship began months before Michael Mitchell's death. It establishes both deceit and motive." Patricia Grimm tried to speak, but the words tangled. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable, then said simply, "Proceed." From that moment on, the tide shifted. Every point Samantha's lawyer made fell flat. Every objection sounded hollow. I sat in that wooden chair, my heart thudding, and thought of my son. How he must have sensed all of this. How he'd moved quietly to protect what he loved. The truth, once set in motion, is like gravity. It doesn't stop. By lunch, Samantha's mask had cracked completely. She huddled in the hallway with her lawyer, gesturing wildly, her voice sharp even through the closed doors. I watched through the glass as the woman who once thought she could destroy me finally realized she'd undone herself. James returned with sandwiches from the courthouse cafe. "They'll try to argue the affair doesn't prove the will's validity," he said, handing me one. I smiled, tired but certain. "Then we'll show Michael knew. We'll show why he changed it. My son didn't just rewrite his will, he rewrote his story." He nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow, we bring in Carlos Rodriguez." Carlos Rodriguez walked into the courtroom the next morning looking like a man who'd misplaced his courage somewhere in the parking lot. He wore a wrinkled gray suit and carried himself with the hesitance of someone stepping onto thin ice. When the bailiff called his name, he flinched, then shuffled to the stand, eyes darting everywhere but toward Samantha. She sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped, face powdered to hide the bruised exhaustion beneath her eyes. The room quieted to a kind of stillness that buzzed. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the rustle of the judge's robe, even the soft creak of James's chair as he rose. "Mr. Rodriguez," James began, voice steady, gentle in a way that made you lean forward to hear. "How long have you known Mrs. Samantha Mitchell?" Carlos swallowed. "About 2 years." "And how did you first meet?" "She came to my office," he said after a pause. "She wanted to increase her husband's life insurance policy." The words landed like a hammer strike. Even Patricia Grimm's pen froze mid-note. James paced slowly. "When was this initial meeting?" "October of 2022. So roughly 8 months before Mr. Mitchell's death." Carlos nodded. "Yes, sir." "And what was the coverage amount at that time?" $200,000. "What did Mrs. Mitchell want to increase it to?" Carlos's voice wavered. $800,000. The courtroom gasped. Someone in the gallery muttered, "Good Lord!" Judge Morrison rapped her gavel once, eyes sharp but curious. "Did Mr. Mitchell agree to this increase?" James asked. "At first, yes, but later, about 6 weeks before he died, he came back to my office to make changes." "What kind of changes?" "He wanted to reduce the coverage back to the original amount and split the beneficiaries between his wife and his mother." My chest tightened. Michael had seen through her. He'd known. "Did he explain why?" "He said he'd learned things about his wife that made him reconsider," Carlos said softly. He didn't go into detail, but he seemed hurt, angry. For the first time, I looked at Samantha. Her posture had collapsed, her eyes glassy. I saw the exact moment she realized the walls were closing in. Patricia tried to recover. "Mr. Rodriguez, isn't it true that you pursued a relationship with Mrs. Mitchell because of this policy?" she asked sharply. "That you took advantage of her emotional state?" Carlos shook his head. "No, ma'am. She pursued me. She said her marriage was over, that her husband was controlling and paranoid. I believed her." His voice broke slightly. "But looking back, I think she targeted me because I had access to insurance information. I was stupid, but she knew exactly what she was doing." The judge watched him closely, then turned her gaze to Samantha, who sat pale as paper, her lawyer whispering urgently. The rest of the day unraveled in slow motion. James used Carlos's testimony to stitch together the pattern, the insurance increase, the affair, the timing of Michael's revised will. Piece by piece, the narrative transformed from rumor into a map of betrayal. When the court recessed for the day, reporters were waiting in the hallway. Cameras flashed, questions flew, and Samantha shielded her face with trembling hands as she pushed through the crowd. That night at home, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, thinking about Michael, his last visit, his quiet eyes, how he'd asked about trust and love as if testing the strength of a bridge before crossing. I realized then he hadn't been lost or confused. He'd been preparing. The next morning at 9 a.m., James called. His voice was different, tense but threaded with something like awe. "Dorothy, I found something in Michael's personal effects returned from the insurance company," he said. "You need to sit down." 30 minutes later, he was at my door with a manila envelope marked, "To be opened only if something happens to me." My knees weakened just seeing Michael's handwriting. At my kitchen table, James unfolded 11 handwritten pages, his eyes glistening as he began to read. "Mom," it started, "if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and I'm no longer here to protect you." The words that followed were a son's final act of defense. He had discovered Samantha's affair, had hired a private investigator, had known about the insurance increase and the plan behind it. "I've changed my will to make sure you're safe," he wrote. "If Samantha contests it, give this letter to James Worthington. Tell him I trust him to take care of you when I can't." By the end, I was crying too hard to speak. James reached across the table and covered my trembling hands. "Your son just handed us the truth, Dorothy," he said softly. "Tomorrow, we end this." The final morning broke clear and cold, the kind of October day where the sunlight looks almost too honest. I dressed slowly, in Michael's favorite color, a deep violet suit I'd saved for church occasions, and pinned his father's flag lapel to my chest. My reflection in the mirror looked steadier than I felt, but beneath the nerves was something fierce, peace sharpened into purpose. When I reached the courthouse at 8:30 a.m., Samantha was already there. Her once perfect hair hung limp, her makeup cracked under the fluorescent lights. She looked like someone who had been awake all night, realizing she'd run out of ways to lie. James greeted me in the hallway, holding the envelope like a relic. "The handwriting analyst confirmed it," he said quietly. "Every loop, every word, it's Michael's." I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. Inside, the gallery filled quickly. Reporters sat along the back row. Even the bailiff seemed invested now, as though the whole courthouse had been waiting to see how the story would end. When Judge Morrison entered, the gavel's echo was the sound of final reckoning. James stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to introduce one final piece of evidence, a letter written by Michael Mitchell 2 days before his death, addressed to his mother." Patricia leapt to her feet. "Objection! Hearsay and potentially fabricated." James barely flinched. "We have authentication from a certified handwriting expert and verification of paper stock purchased by Mr. Mitchell on March 14th. The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Proceed." The letter trembled slightly in James's hands as he began to read. "Mom, if you're reading this, my worst fears have come true." His voice filled the room, gentle and devastating. Michael described discovering Samantha's affair, how he'd followed the patterns, calls to Carlos, visits to the insurance office, questions about policies that didn't make sense. He'd known she was planning something, maybe not murder, but manipulation at least. "I can't prove she intends harm," he'd written, "but the timing is too perfect. I have to protect you, Mom. If something happens to me, I want you safe, secure, and free from her reach." Every word was a blade turned toward the truth. Samantha sat motionless at first, then began to shake her head slowly, muttering, "No, no," under her breath. James continued, "I've changed my will to reflect what's right. Samantha will have enough to live comfortably, but not enough to destroy herself with greed. The house and investments go to you, Mom, so you'll never have to worry." By the time he reached the end, I was gripping the edge of the table to keep from collapsing under the weight of it. "What matters now," the letter concluded, "is that you live the life you deserve. If she challenges this, give this to James. I trust him to finish what I started." Silence swept the courtroom. Even Patricia Grimm's polished composure had wilted. The judge took the pages, read the signature, then set them down slowly, eyes lingering on Samantha. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, "do you have anything to add?" Samantha's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The woman who once could sell sympathy like perfume had finally run out of words. When Judge Morrison returned from chambers less than an hour later, her ruling was brief but final. "I find no evidence of undue influence or fraud. The will dated 6 weeks before Mr. Mitchell's death is valid and shall be enforced as written." She paused, then added, "Furthermore, based on the testimony and evidence presented, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential insurance fraud and conspiracy." The gavel fell like a stone dropped into deep water. One sound, then silence. Samantha's chair scraped back. She stood, trembling, mascara streaking down her face. "This isn't over," she whispered, though even she seemed not to believe it. Her lawyer didn't meet her eyes. When she fled the room, flashes from the reporters outside painted her in bursts of white light, each one capturing the moment a facade collapsed. Weeks later, I learned she'd been arrested on conspiracy charges. Carlos Rodriguez cooperated, taking a plea deal and leaving town soon after. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. And when it was over, when the noise faded and the papers were signed, I returned to Michael's house, the one with the garden he planted for me, the one where Sunday dinners used to fill every corner with laughter. Now, at 71, the house is quiet, but full of his memory. I still set an extra plate on Sundays out of habit. Sometimes Tyler visits with his drone, showing me sunrises and migrating birds instead of scandal. Sometimes Carlos's ex-wife calls just to say thank you for exposing what she could never see. People ask if I feel vindicated. I don't. What I feel is peace. My son spent his final weeks building a wall of protection between me and a woman who mistook love for opportunity. His last gift wasn't the inheritance, it was the truth that freed us both. So if you're watching this, thank you for listening. Remember to protect what's good, to trust your instincts, and to never underestimate quiet people. They often carry the sharpest truth. Please like this video, share it with someone who believes in justice, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my place?